Good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Francisco Aragon, and I direct Letras Latinas, the literary initiative at Notre Dame's Institute for Latino Studies, also known as the ILS. The ILS is pleased to be partnering with our creative writing program for tonight's presentation as part of Hispanic Heritage Month. We are here to celebrate the work of British Latinx poet Leo Boix, specifically his new book, Ballad of a Happy Immigrant. Part one of our program embodies this notion, which I first heard in the mid-1980s by poet Robert Pinsky, which says, a poem is not a fully realized work of art until it is uttered aloud by someone other than its author. And so I'm pleased to welcome special guests, Janelle Pineda, Antonio Lopez, Alexandra Litton Regalado, and Yvette Siegert, who will join me, each of us reading and commenting on one of Leo's poems from this wonderful book. Yvette, after her reading, will then transition us to part two of our program, during which she will converse with Leo, not only about his work, but on the state of British Latinx poetry, as well as invite him to share a piece from his book. The poem I'd like to share can be found on page 10, and it's titled Eucalyptus. It's one of a handful that Leo dedicates to his father. Eucalyptus. After years of searching, I find my father standing by the old tree he'd pruned every spring to grow leafy before the sweltering heat of our subtropical summer. Who's there? He asks. I'm your son, Dad. Tu hijo. Your first wife's dead, like you. We buried her south of Buenos Aires. ¿Y yo? He inquires, a dirty mate gourd in his tarred hands. You're interred somewhere north of the General Paz motorway. He nods, sips his sweet drink, gives me a tangerine, then crosses the empty patio to his unkempt tool shed. Hand saws, nails getting rustier. I leave by the yard door. He whistles from his world through the dream where the tree grows taller every time I look back. The poet Marianne Moore, when writing a poem about poetry, spoke of an imaginary garden with real toads in them. I thought of this while reading Eucalyptus, the way Leo movingly creates and cultivates his garden of 25 indented lines, a space where a living son can converse with a dead father. I don't think it's a coincidence that the speaker of the poem finds his father standing by the old tree he'd pruned every spring to grow leafy. Had Leo been thinking of Marianne Moore? Whether he intended to or not, he evoked her garden to this reader. But unlike Moore's unspecified garden, here we experience a particular geography with a particular weather, the sweltering heat of our subtropical summer. And his use of the phrase tu hijo, Spanish for your son, clearly conveys we're in a Spanish-speaking space before all doubt is erased when mention is made of a first wife buried south of Buenos Aires, the capital of Argentina. This imaginative leap takes a further twist when it's implied that the father doesn't seem to be aware that he's dead. But when the son informs him that he's buried somewhere north of the General Paz motorway, the father doesn't appear at all troubled. On the contrary, he continues to enjoy a life of the senses, sipping his sweet drink, and also gifting his son a likely sweet tangerine. And why should he be troubled? Eucalyptus is firmly part of that lineage where the living and the dead coexist in a way that borders on what I'll call the beautifully banal. It made me think of other works of Latin American literature where this is the case. Perhaps most notably, the Mexican masterpiece Pedro Páramo by Juan Rulfo. And yet the poem is not written in Spanish, it's written in English, which speaks to the reality of a large swath of Latinx poetry. In Leo's case, British Latinx poetry. And now I'd like to invite Janelle Pineda to share another of Leo's poems. Janelle, take it away.
Hello, everyone. The poem that I'll be reading of Leo's is called Elephant and Castle. It can be found on page 36. Elephant and Castle. It wasn't the Infanta de Castilla, nor Castile's long-gone elephant, but a shopping center arcade where Latinos dined at La Bodeguita. Everyone congregates in the main yellow concourse. At the small Al Paso cafeterias, they've been talking of how the leftist mayor approved the final plans by Delancey developers to demolish the rundown center. A pesar de prometer lo contrario, el hijo puta, el descarao, and all for a few quid. El cabrón lo pagará bien caro. They'll tear down the salmon pink pachyderm carrying the white castle turret as he rises regal on top of such expensive land. The grandiose bronze mastodon, especially made for the big market in 1965, taken from an old pub, now bulldozed. But he stands so majestic on a tall pedestal atop Los Colorados, Tienda Latina, and the arepa and tamales shop as he surveys his dwindling empire. I chose this poem because I think that one of the really important things that Leo is doing in this book, among other things, is that there's such an important documentation of British Latinx history and of Latinx communities in the UK. And I think as a US-born Latinx person, understanding the cultural importance of Elephant and Castle as a Latinx hub, which has so many, histories of, migrant communities from Colombia, from Venezuela, from Chile, from all over. I think that it's so powerful to see that rendered in this space. And I think that something that strikes me about it as well is the poem is describing the process of gentrification, right? The elephant is on such expensive land, right? We're not thinking about the impact of this particular center on the families and communities who have really called it home for so long. Now it's become a development project. And as someone who got to see Elephant and Castle in its glory, right, I think it's so just such a beautiful homage to the space. where you have, Latinos congregating, dining at La Bodeguita, right? These beautiful, beautiful images. And that's all kind of just taken, and we see how that is transformed within the poem. I especially love the closing image of the elephant surveying his dwindling empire, right? And how that challenges notions of empire and what that means. Yeah, this poem is really special to me. Thank you, Leo, for writing it. Now I would like to introduce Antonio Lopez for the next poem.
Thank you, Janelle. Good evening, everyone. Buenas noches, buenas tardes, buenos días. I'm not sure where everybody's at, but it's an international audience. Es un enorme placer to be here to celebrate and educate you all of Leo's book. Just let me echo first, again, Antonio Lopez, let me echo the excitement that's already been expressed by the literary familia present here tonight and say what a pleasure it is to celebrate Leo's book, Ballad of a Happy Immigrant. If you haven't done so already, please do purchase a copy for you, for your tío, your tías, your loved ones, maybe that neighbor you've been meaning to chit chat, but need an icebreaker post-pandemic, mid-pandemic, this is it. Not that you all need further convincing, but if you all want another reason to buy this book, indulge me for a moment as I read one of my favorite poems in the collection. It's titled Gondwanaland, and it goes like this. And you may find it on page 5. So I will go ahead and actually, I think it's worth to see on the page. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so y'all can follow along with me, grammar school style. 1 second. All right. Gondwanaland. Everybody see that? Great. Gondwanaland. You robbed so bold. You son from port to port, your dialects and lenguajes, mil lenguas, your soul and skies, you cracked your multiple parts, your beaches and playas, your flores, you're killed and taken, you histórica and retórica, you torn, you plain, baroque, moderna, austere, reclaimed, stained, entera, untamed, you spilling and pulling and sprouting and tropical, your deserts, your indios, your suns, your dwindling forests and rivers, your cities and buses and serpents and spiders, your rios, your secrets still hidden, your people, tu gente, tus plantas, your trees, your mountains, montañas, your spoil, unspoiled, your vast pampas, esteros, your history and blood, your women, their eyes, your hair and dark hands weaving, your drugs and your men, these songs untold, your oh. Right. So I adore so much of this poem. Its linguistic energy, the almost dizzying litany of landscapes. You can hear it in the poem, and people that, again, the speaker odes to, how the you is sort of this, to me, it's a marker of indictment, right? We're hearing all these historical people and landscapes for a marker of indictment, and then it slips into irredentism, right? So the desire to restore a country to its full fore. There's an ambivalence I'm seeing. Is a sheer sense of awe that the unnamed you has achieved so much in the name of pillage and acquisition. We start off with that phrase, you robbed so bold. And to me, that bold, it captures the mixed emotions that the speaker has to homeland, how it's both the site of memory that's cherished and lamented, but also the poem shuttles between what Claudia Rankine once proffered, the historical self versus the self-self. The land is both victima and assailant, conqueror and conquered. And of course, the poem takes the form of the country itself. That's why I wanted to show it to you all. And therefore, Leo is employing a style that's sometimes called the French calligram, or simply a shape poem. And so the question is why? What do we make of that form? And like Francisco was saying, we can only a guess as critics, as interpreters. So to me, what Leo is saying here, that a country's language, first and foremost, houses its history. And in this poem, and a very fraught history. And we see evidence of just that. And one final point worth mentioning here is that there are two punctuations in the poem. And I think to me that fact epitomizes the poem itself. The question mark in the middle, which again I'll read, your mountains, montañas, your spoiled line break, unspoiled, question mark. And then we have the exclamation at the end, preceded by a series of O's. So you have questioning on the one hand and praising on the other, skepticism and celebration. And to me, that's the poem. It's this beautiful weaving, wavering and wandering of those two emotional poles. And to me, that's what a lot of identity is trapped in. And so on that note, I think a lot of us as children of immigrants, whether Argentinos or Dominicanos, Black, what have you, we can deeply resonate with this poem and its question, I think, inherent to it, which is, how do we, as children of immigrants, as people of color, disentangle that longing in diaspora, oftentimes proud, for motherland, while reckoning with its raw history and fraught present, even when, and especially when, the nations in which we live in and our families live in continue to humiliate that homeland, to denigrate it, to challenge it. We've heard presidents call them shithole countries. And so on the one hand, we want to claim that land, and yet we have to be candid and really flesh out its sins, its past. And so I think, to me, this poem does an extraordinary job of doing that. So congratulations, Leo, on the poem and as well the collection. But enough about me. Ahora tengo the enormous pleasure to presentar our next reader for this evening, the one and only Alexandria Lidner Regalado, who I would be remiss if I didn't congratulate her for winning the coveted National Poetry Series for her manuscript, Reliquenda. And truly, it's a testament to how global and gorgeous our literary community is. So we're certainly celebrating Leo, but also want to give a shout out to her. Mil felicidades, Alexandria. As the poet of Queensbridge, Nas says, whose world is this? The world is yours. And so is the floor. Alexandria.
Gracias, Antonio, for such a lovely intro and for your deep and rich interpretation of Leo's poem. Really, this is just such a special night. This is an incredible moment for me to be here together with all of you, and especially Las Mujeres Salvadoreñas, Janelle and Yvette. So I want to talk a little bit about how I first met Leo. It was through Francisco, and this was back in May of 2020, when we were invited by Natalie Tetlier to work on a poetry collaboration. And this came at such an opportune moment because during the first wave of COVID, the borders of El Salvador closed. This is where I live right now and where I am. I was separated from my family, and I was stranded in Miami for more than 3 months. And together with Leo, working long distance during that time, him and Deal and me in Miami, and then back in El Salvador, and through the course of the summer, we ended up writing what would be a chapbook length series of poems that responds to the work of Hungarian Mexican photographer Kati Horna. And through this process, we learned that we had a lot in common. Our fathers had both recently died, and our poems were taking this strong direction, looking towards nature and animals for connections and symbolism. And at the time, he was writing a series of quarantine haiku and putting together the final edits to this book that we're celebrating tonight. But in general, we found that our voices and our writing style flowed quite well together. We were both addressing themes of body and communication and inarticulation, these broken and mended family ties, much of the themes that are present in his book, which we're celebrating tonight. And I just felt an immediate connection to him and to his poetry. And so I want to thank you, Leo, for your poetry, and thank you to all of you here gathered tonight, and to Francisco for organizing this. I'm going to read one of his Leo's poems called Cycles. And it begins with a quote by Robert Frost. We love the things we love for what they are. Cycles. Blackbird's gone until next year's bonanza. He left a simple cup, nest full of dried twigs. hares, courtyard detritus barely hanging on a wisteria climber that never flowers, its badly grafted roots compressed down into our house's underside. It grew faster, taller than we first thought. Love witness, even these thunderous wrens, troglodytes, like to catch hidden flies, tiny spiders dangling over light green leaves, shoots. These signs we've learned to read every English summer, almost by chance. Leo has this amazing ability to distill images and extract essences. In certain ways, this poem has a William Carlos Williams vibe in its dual reality of apparent simplicity and inherent complexity. But Leo's skills penetrate beyond the language level, and the poem takes on almost a photographic quality. He uses haiku-length lines to pare back and pace the painting of the image as it reveals itself in sections, like it's in a chemical bath developing. The blackbird is the first actor here, and he's more than a bird, this black-winged thing that has abandoned his nest of dried twigs and hair and promises to return for next year's bonanza. The cycle has notched into transition. The wisteria hasn't rooted properly. It's planted in an unfavorable spot. All of these details suggest a feeling of absence, a waning period, a lull. But there's also a measured degree of hope. It grew more than they expected. And then there's an interesting turn, an address to love as witness to the tangle of what's left over. There's new life taking over the thunderous wrens and a detailed description of the tiny spiders dangling over the light green leaves. I think what I connect with the most is the end, because you come to understand that all of these things the speaker observes so closely, they've transformed into symbols and signs, something they've learned to read. And then there's this kind of surprise when all of these elements come together and make sense. They send a message, how the speaker says, almost by chance. And everything feels serendipitous and charged with meaning. I can relate the we to people in new places, an immigrant speaker, of course, or the we of a new relationship that has taken a turn. The Frost quote speaks to me about what I've learned about love, how it can't have aspirations. It needs to be grounded in reality. You can't love someone for who they could be or who they were. We have to constantly check in with who they are now and love them in the present, and also love ourselves in the present. So this cycle keeps bringing us back to the now. Thank you, Leo. It's now my honor to present my friend Yvette Siegert, fellow cantomundista and poeta salvadoreña, and winner of the 2021 Poetry Society of America Chapbook Fellowship. Te paso la palabra, Yvette, y te mando un abrazo.
Otro abrazo para ti, Alexandra. Gracias de corazón. Good evening, everyone. Hello from Oxford, England, where it is a delicious midnight hour, and I'm sitting here drinking coffee, which it's something that in and of itself reminds me of my childhood in Latin America, so maybe appropriate on many levels. First, just a brief visual description of me. Is that I'm a curly-haired Latinx woman in a red blouse, sitting in a mustard-colored armchair in front of white bookcases. So that aside, I will now say that the poem I will be sharing this evening is entitled Birds Leaving Earth #1, which you can find on page 52 of the book. And I will be sharing my screen with you because I think it's useful to see this poem as much as it is to hear it. And it has a visual component that I think you'll enjoy. So bear with me while I try this. You see that? Okay. So, Birds Leaving Earth 1. You can always escape, leave through a back door, a crack, yellow bird, black auger, Los pájaros no van a ninguna parte. There is a fire somewhere, a recurrent theme, an errant flock of southern invaders. The towers burn the sky. A call explodes in ruby reds, oranges. La selva se enciende. There is no escape. You can always lie about your beginnings, the odd color of your exodus, yellow bird, black auger. I stole this, they took that. As you turn, look back. Beware of salt statues, of feathered things going in circles, sensing the impending night. So this poem resonated with me immediately the first time I read the book. Leo and I share a certain obsession with birds, which I think is common amongst poets, or so I hear. Birds as symbols of lyric and song, of flight and migration, of what is intricate and haunted, and of what Carl Phillips rightly calls trading in mystery. In ancient Rome, the behavior of birds could be interpreted as signs of divine favor or dark omen, and that's in here too, as is the idea of birds that mimic, that serve as a kind of interlocutor for us. But the poem also opens up the entire book for me, encapsulating its kinetic energy, its vibrant visuality and shape-shifting, as well as the poet's unapologetic multilingualism, his use of ekphrasis, here, as you can see in the image, with art by the poet Lawrence Ferlinghetti, and also his various themes and preoccupations, the exploration of belonging and of interstitial spaces. I'm really struck by how these lines recall the invocation on page 1, which you'll remember is called Peregrination, where the speaker says, quote, I turn back, gather my things, come here, look down at your own past, unquote. That title, of course, comes from the Latin peregrinus, for foreign traveling, and its challenge recalls another bird, the peregrine falcon. If we read this book as the poet's origin story in a new country and a book about the negotiations with the loss of a homeland, then it's also a kind of rewriting of Genesis. And this poem carries us forward from the earlier poems about Noah's Ark, say on page 13, the poem High Altar, to here the story of Lot's wife, a tale of escape and exile, of displacement and longing. But the most striking feature of this poem for me is its shape and the emptiness at its center. Look at this stunning narrow caesura down the page. It's interrupted once, but just think about this. The lines literally open up like the Red Sea in the Exodus, or zigzag like a Rorschach image or a pair of shadow silhouette portraits. It is a chasm looking into the past, the veil of the temple torn asunder, if you will. It's a passage for flight and escape, a route, an exit, or maybe it's not that. Maybe it's the Atlantic Ocean with the columns of text as bookending continents, two geographies that our poet must navigate with their different but intertwining logics. As an echo of our beautiful transatlantic exchange this evening, maybe the poem is also the chasm of translation between languages and cultures, and all the links between, also the links between them, the processing of the bilingual mind or the distance between languages. Are these spaces pointing to erasures? Are they suggesting a kind of loss in the archive of Latin American violence and legacies of colonialism? I don't know, but the Latinx poet inhabits all this in-betweenness and suspension of knowing. The poet inscribes his poetics of the in-between into existence. As he says in a later poem, I, Leonardo, on my black and yellow wings. This poem makes me think and please bear with me on this, makes me think of an unlikely point of reference, not Latinx or Latine, but Latin authors working in what is now England, in what had once been the far-flung limits of the Roman Empire. In the 8th century, the Venerable Bede, whom you know from Caedmon's song, wrote a very savvy, gripping church history in Latin, one of my favorite books. And he wrote it about the gens Anglorum, the English people. What characterized this new people for Bede was not their homogeneity, but rather the sum of their many languages, which converged and braided together. This notion of a multilingual people, of translation across language and space, challenges the idea of a monolingual English publishing culture in the UK. Multilingualism is what unifies, bridging that chasm down the middle. So with this, I conclude part 1 of our evening. Thank you, Francisco, Janelle, Antonio, and Alexandra for reading these selections and offering up such rich, generous insights. Our choices, I think, reveal our own poetics, and they become inscribed here with Leo's in a gorgeous transatlantic red poética. I also want to thank Joel, Johannes, Letras Latinas, our audience, and the Creative Writing Program for hosting us this evening. As a segue, in the celebration, which I think this is more celebration than traditional reading, it's now my enormous pleasure to introduce Leo, with whom I will be speaking about his work and the state of British Latinx poetry. So we are not here, I want to preface by saying that we're not here to make generalizations about what constitutes British Latinx writing, but I want to take Leo's work as one example, one lens into our literary community's multiplicity and multilingualism. So the way that this will work is that I will now offer a bio, then we will chat, and Leo will close the exchange by reading a poem. So who is this poet whose work you've been reading and hearing? I think literary bios can be so dry, and it's a shame because, in fact, literary bios are populated as complex and populated as a Bosch triptych, which reflects the community and exchange that emerges from any writer's work. This Zoom panel, like a triptych, also reflects the many layers of personal exchanges among us. Leo actually gives us an autobiographical triptych on page 11. Pero es un tremendo gusto presentarte, Leo. It moves me to see this gathering of voices surrounding your work. So, Leo Boix, Leonardo Boix, you are a fully bilingual British Latinx poet and translator, born in Argentina and based in Southern England. Our friend Natalie Teitler, who I think was one of the greatest champions for Latinx writers anywhere, has called you the ambassador for British Latinx writing. You have published 2 collections in Spanish, Un Lugar Propio and Mar de Noche. And this new book in our hands is in English, published by Chatto Windus. Your work also features in several anthologies, most notably 10 Poets of the New Generation, out with Bloodaxe, and the British Latinx anthology that you co-edited, Un Nuevo Sol, published by Flipdie. Your English language poetry won the Keats-Shelley Prize a few years ago, and these have appeared transatlantically, which to me is key, from poetry and letras libres in the Americas to leading UK publications like the Poetry Review, Modern Poetry and Translation, PN Review, the Rialto, and Magma. As a translator, you are about to release a volume of poems that I'm very interested in by the Argentinian writer Diana Velesi with the Poetry Translation Center. You are an alumnus of the Complete Works Poetry, which for our US audience was this amazing long-term mentoring program for UK writers of color, founded by Natalie and Bernardine Evaristo. You're also a former journalist and an active book critic. And in this role, I should say, for full transparency, you are my mentor in the Library Poetry Critics Scheme, which I'm very delighted by, and also co-director of Invisible Presence, an initiative akin to the US-based Canto Mundo, for instance, designed to showcase emerging voices of Latinx poets. Leo, we wear so many hats. It's such a pleasure to celebrate all these facets of your work. And I do want to say, before we jump into this conversation, that as an American living in the UK, I feel that I'm inhabiting this interstitial space, like the speaker of your poems. And because of that, I feel like saying both welcome, bienvenido, but also thank you for making me feel so welcome during these first few years in Inglaterra. So any opening responses to the readings you heard tonight, or you want to talk about birds?
Oh, Yvette, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. That was really moving. I'm quite speechless. I'm so emotional somehow. I feel really moved by all the comments and the responses by these amazing and brilliant poets and friends and colleagues. I'm really touched, and it's fascinating to see other poets reading your poems and sort of looking at things that perhaps you didn't see that in the first place. And so for that, I thank you to all of you. It's been really amazing, and yes, thanks Yvette for that lovely introduction.
So it's hard to know where to begin, but I am very struck, for instance, by the fact that you published these works in Spanish and then made the decision to publish a collection in English. And so I wondered if you might tell us a little bit about the process of that decision, the kinds of aesthetic choices and challenges that came along with it, if that's relevant, formal differences between your Spanish and English work.
Yeah, very much so. Well, as you said, I published two collections in Spanish, Un Lugar Propio and Mar de Noche in Argentina, while I was in the UK. And for a long time, I wrote only in Spanish. And it was actually Natalie Tatler, who came to one of our readings. I was reading in a community center, mostly for people who spoke only Spanish. And Natalie came to me and we talked, and she said, I think you could try to write something in English and send it to me. And it was really challenging. And I remember talking with some of my poet friends from Latin America, and some of them were like, "You're mad, estás loco, your mother tongue is Spanish, you shouldn't be writing in English." And that actually fired me, gave me, I thought, why not? So I started writing, and I sent some of those poems to Natalie. By then I was already here in the UK for over 15 years. Writing in English, but mostly essays or articles, but never poetry. And Natalie was very instrumental. She encouraged me, and we worked together. And then I applied to the Complete Works, and I became the first Latinx poet to be included in this very prestigious scheme. And that again gave me a lot of confidence. And I had great mentors. Michael Schmidt, for instance, was one of my mentors. And then, I was publishing poems in magazines, and I realized by then that I had to write a book in English. It made total sense. My friends were here in the UK. My audience was here. When I was writing my poems in Spanish, I was thinking of an audience so far away from here. I was thinking of an audience in Argentina or in South America. or perhaps, for the tiny, audience here, the Latin American people who are coming to these readings, who, by the way, I mean, those were the early moments of, those really, important moments. I have to say that, being part of those collectives, SLAP, Spanish and Latin American poets and writers in the UK, and other groups, it was actually really important, and we were all, working together in quite sort of difficult situations and difficult sort of, in trying to find spaces and going to the poetry library in London and gathering and sort of giving each other support. And I'm still in touch with them, but I felt that by writing in English, I was writing to my friends. I was actually writing for my friends to be able to read my work. And I didn't want to translate my work from Spanish into English. Somehow that was a very conscious decision. I'm a translator, and I translate from Spanish into English, it was sort of quite organic, and the process of writing this collection. So it's a really interesting point, because every time I read, people come to me and they always said, "Oh, you write in both languages, in Spanish and in English, and tell me how it is." And I always say that I write very differently in Spanish and in English. I feel like I do have a different poetic persona somehow. I have some, I have similar themes, but formally the poetry is very different. Perhaps because in English I had more training, I had more mentors, I had more people commenting on the poems and the work, and that gave me a different perspective somehow. So I was, as you can see it in the collection, I'm really interested in form. There's loads of poetic forms that I explored, from odes to sonnets to ballads. So many different forms, where in Spanish I'm somehow less interested in looking at form. Even now when I write poetry in Spanish, I finished a series of poems in Spanish very recently, inspired or based on Astor Piazzolla's tangos, and I it kind of comes from a different place somehow. It's almost like the language is sort of embedded, is somehow inside me, Spanish, and that poetry comes from a different place. Where I always say this, where when I write in English, I feel like the language is outside me. I can see it perhaps more clearly, and I can mold it. It's almost like I can sculpt it into the form I like. There's that distance that somehow allows me to write differently, and yes, I always, when the moment I sit down and write something in English, I always feel like perhaps I don't know all the words in English, but I'm going to use the ones I know. I'm going to explore the ones I know, and that's how it comes. I'm writing more in English in the last couple of years, probably because of the book and different projects, and less so in Spanish. But the moment I go back to Argentina, the moment I'm in South America, immediately I respond to Spanish, and I write again in Spanish. Perhaps shorter poems, or commission pieces. For instance, the one I mentioned about, or inspired by Astor Piazzolla and Pino Solanas.
It's interesting because it's what you describe is not just a question of writing in different forms or styles in different languages, but it's a relational thing, right? Like you started out talking about finding mentors and writing poems for your friends. So there is a way in which your work makes me think a lot about relationality, that it finds its audiences, and you find people who draw out different aspects of your work, much like our personalities can engage differently with different people. So, for instance, for those who don't know, in the audience in the US, Michael Schmidt is the publisher of Carcanet, a poetry publisher in the UK, and he's from Mexico. And Natalie is also from Argentina. And you couldn't have found better mentors, really. These two people who can negotiate the two literary traditions and kind of broaching the two, not just two traditions, but for simplicity's sake, let's think about like the Latin American poetry tradition and British literary work that we engage with in schools. But you bring those voices into your work really beautifully. And I wondered if you might talk a little bit about that, the people, how you find yourself negotiating your influences from Spanish poetry while writing in English. That's something that interests me right now a lot as a poet.
Well, because I guess because I translate quite a bit, and translation is always part of the process of writing in a way that comes quite naturally. In a way, I've got different sources and inspirations when I write, and I might be reading a book to review or to translate, and immediately I feel like I need to perhaps respond to that specific work, be in Spanish or in English. Sometimes if it's in Spanish, I perhaps might use a line or a word that might be the starting point of that poem, or in the case of the British or English or American poetry, it would be like a line again, or even the form. Francisco mentioned Maria Moore, and she was quite influential. I was obsessed by this counting, the syllabic counting, and I realized that for the English speakers, writing the sonnet with that kind of rhythm it kind of comes quite natural. And if you're not an English speaker, that is slightly harder because you don't have that. So for me, counting syllables was a much easier proposition. So I was obsessed, and I'm still obsessed of kind of this kind of counting. And I wrote many syllabic poems. There are a few in the collection, some cinquains, inspired by Maria Moore and Adelaide Crafty, the inventor of the cinquain form, and haikus as well. And that's another example. But yes, I guess yes, I'm talking about sort of influences and especially coming from both sides, from South America, Spanish and English, from the Anglo world. And in my collection, for instance, there are poems that I wrote that got Guanaland that Antonio read beautifully. A poem inspired by the concrete movement that started in South America, that began in Brazil, with the Haroldo de Campos and the Siopignatari, and but also looking back at the visual poetry of Huidobro, or there's so many poets from South America. So by writing those poems, I wrote a series of visual poems. I was in a way responding to that kind of tradition of Latin American poetry visually. So the actual shape, the poem, that was what started. Specifically the Gondwanaland. I wanted to create a poem in the shape of South America and also the shape of Argentina. They're both quite similar. And
like Mafalda's famous cartoon, yeah.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. So that sort of created inspired the poem. But it's always like, I always say that I'm a magpie, and I'm constantly reading things, and I'm inspired by those things, and I respond to those things. I'm that kind of writer that, if I'm reading something, I immediately want to respond to it. I was reading Anglo-Saxon poetry, and there were these kind of beautiful poems about migrants and people moving from one place to the other. and I connected to those poems so much. And although they were written so long ago, and I thought I have to write something, and then I wrote a series of mistranslations. So I thought, okay, I'm going to translate those into my own language, my own reality, my own, now.
No, it's so interesting because those old English epigraphs or starting points, maybe that's why I think about your work alongside Bede of all people, because that idea of using or incorporating the language of people into an official history is something that I find really inspiring. I don't want to lose the thread of translation, but that's a point I really want to get to. But just to wrap up my questions about influence or engagement with other work, I wanted to see if you might talk a little bit about ekphrasis, because the poem that I shared, Birds Leaving Earth 1, is inspired by these images by the poet, Ferlinghetti. You've talked a lot on other occasions about your engagement with Bosch, like the triptych of hell and paradise. Could you talk a little bit about how you understand ekphrasis in your work and what that does, how that activates poetic thinking for you?
I was always fascinated by visual art, and it's it's not coincidence that my partner is a visual artist, a Latinx visual artist. So I'm involved in the art world, in the contemporary art world somehow through Pablo, my partner. And I was always, we will go to museums and look at paintings all the time in South America or in here in the UK. And initially I thought that my first collection was going to be based or inspired by Bosch, mostly because I had this really fascinating conversations with Nat and some other friends. And I realized that there were so many interesting things about the paintings of Bosch. The violence, the symbolism, the violence in terms, for me, connecting the violence of, in Argentina and during the dictatorship. And I thought this is a really interesting way of looking at the painting. So I went to Madrid and I spent a week looking at all the paintings by Bosch in the Museo del Prado, and I was writing furiously, and I wrote loads of poems inspired by Bosch, responding to specific triptychs, responding to details in triptychs. In Un Nuevo Sol, in the anthology, there are a couple of poems that are based or inspired by Bosch. I think there is a triptych there, and there are a couple of poems. Yeah, exactly. And the triptychs actually are, because of most of Bosch paintings are triptychs. And then slowly that changed, and the collection became some, a different proposition, because I was actually realizing I was trying to say something much wider. So Bosch was in a way sort of limiting me, but I kept some of the poems, and I realized that looking at the painting and responding to the painting in many different ways, visually or perhaps thematically, or perhaps just looking at one individual aspect of the painting. I wrote this sonnet called The Unholy Family, which won the Keats-Shelley Prize. And it's right. Yeah, exactly. It's inspired by a detail in one of Bosch paintings that speaks of a family moving, basically, exodus. So it comes quite natural. This ekphrastic proposition somehow. If I go to a museum and something really makes a sort of an impact, I would definitely write something, even if it's just a couple of lines or some words or even a sonnet or something there, or when I'm back, and I keep that always. And that sometimes morphs or changes into a different thing. But yeah, I respond to in a similar way that, you know, I was saying, you know, when I read something and I, you know, I respond. I guess, yeah, that's what happens. Yeah.
No, and I raise also the question about Bosch because I know, for instance, the importance of Bosch in modern Argentine poetry. I mean, Alejandra Pizarnik, whom I've translated for years, she creates a very different relationship to this very powerful work. She also spent a lot of time in the Prado looking at these triptychs, but it's her interpretation is harrowing in a very different framework as yours, and so that to me is also a kind of translation, a very interesting way of, say, not rupturing an Argentine tradition. I'm not saying that, but showing how one can bring fresh eyes to a visual text as a poet and break free, I guess, of previous
I mean, in terms
poems.
Of the translation, I have to say that being a journalist, I started as a journalist. I was a correspondent for various outlets. I was writing in in London for Latin American audiences. I was correspondent Revista Proceso in Mexico, and many other newspapers, and that, you know, and that started the whole translation for me, because I was writing about the royal family to Latin America. I was always trying to explain ideas, or I remember writing about when Diana died, or terrorist attacks, and even on television or radio, people would ask me, and how come, and you know, how come there's a queen in England, and why people like always translating for the Latin American audiences, you know, as we were discussing the other day, you know, translating, you know, culturally, linguistically, you know, in so many ways. And then I realized actually that that was the beginning of my career as a translator. Then I became a literary translator. Yeah, but it's almost like a process that is there all the time when I read, or
I understand. You and I have too many things in common, because I started out as a journalist as well and transitioned to literary translation from that same desire to move away from having to translate local events for a certain American audience. So it's striking to hear you say that. But speaking of translation, I want to stay with this for a few more minutes, because I know that, as Joelle was telling me a few weeks ago, some of our MFA students in the audience write in English as an additional language. In the past, we've talked about how translation praxis can activate a certain kind of linguistic play in your work, my work, as poets, while informing the way we think about broader questions of cultural translation, as you've just discussed. And maybe thinking about how this could be a lens for understanding the shifting and divergent landscapes of British Latinx poetry right now. Your book is peppered with so-called mistranslations, with like this formal play based on translation. You have a poem called Charm for a Journey, a mistranslation, Charm for a Swarm of Bees. And then you have these translations as variations on Eilson. Could you talk a little bit about this, and you know, or even things like advice for emerging writers who are thinking about playing with translation a bit?
I mean, you mentioned the variations on Eilson's poems, and that was, I would say, the beginning of the whole sequence of mistranslations and variations, and it all was, again, going back to what I was saying, it was me reading Eilson's and wanting to first to translate his work into English, and then to respond to my translations, to write my own versions. And in a way, it was a way of, you know, for me to kind of converse, to talk to the poet who actually died 15 years or 20 years ago. it was because I was reading Ailton so closely. I was so immersed in his poetry that I realized I was actually talking to him. I realized that he had so many things in common with me. He was a gay poet who ended up in Europe. He was an artist. He was very prolific as an artist, and so I decided to translate his work, and then the versions. And I thought I will do columns. I will do, you know, the original, then my translations and my versions of the translations. And when I run workshops, I always encourage poets or writers to do this as an exercise, to you know, try to read a poem and try to do a translation and a version of that translation or a version of that poem as a way of, first of all, of reading that poem really closely, to getting to know that poem or that poet really well, and then just write your own version, write your response, because in a way you're teaching yourself to be active in that kind of, you know, a process of translation and creation. And also kind of, for me, it kind of always reminds me that translation is a very active process. You're always creating something, you know, in the process. You're not only, you know, moving one thing from one language to another. You're creating a new thing. You are, you know, deciding on words, and there's so many choices there. So in a way, that's something that for me was really important. And then the mistranslations were comments on this thing of, like, when you translate, what is the thing? Where are the things that get lost in that process? You know, going back to the, you know, the cultural translations and people, you know, trying to explain to audiences, you know, things that perhaps are impossible to explain or impossible to translate. So a mistranslation plays on that idea that there isn't a perfect translation. We're always trying to translate, and sometimes we fail, or the failing is part of the process. It comes with the process, and for me, it's almost like a daily experience. It's almost like sometimes I feel like being in the UK from Argentina, every day I'm trying to understand things that surround me, and sometimes I get things wrong, and yeah.
I mean, it's like translation. I sometimes think that my brain deliberately mistranslates something because, one, it wants to learn something through that mistake, or it sees the possibility of that error as a point of departure for some creative work that I turn into a poem. And I'm also inspired by the work you've done, say, with students in London who speak Spanish at home and who've had encounters with you where they work on translation, and it's the first time that they see the Spanish, the home language, as something that they could use creatively. And there's a lot of work in the UK being done on this through groups like Shadow Heroes, the British Centre for Literary Translation, the Poetry Translation Centre. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I was poet in residence in a school in South London, St. Gabriel's, and there 70% of the students are Latino or Latinx heritage. And I remember going there to read, first of all, to read my poetry in Spanish, because although they spoke Spanish at home, as you were saying, they were reluctant to use Spanish at school, and they thought that they couldn't write in Spanish. They wanted to hide that kind of Latin American heritage, because they wanted to be British. They wanted to be like the rest of their friends. And when I went there and I read my poems, especially from my collection, my first collection, Un Lugar Propio, where I talk about all those things of moving from Argentina to the UK and that process and leaving family members behind. I remember the students just I could see that they were really moved, and they immediately responded by writing poems in Spanish, and they were empowered by the experience. I felt like, because I told them, you can write in both languages. You can have a poem in Spanish and keep your English, and have both experiences. This is part of who you are, and keep that and as a sort of as an extra tool. And the work that we've done together was pretty incredible, because we were looking at Latin American poetry, and at the same time they were doing the A levels in English, looking at poetry, British poetry. So for them it was like an extra world. They didn't know much about Latin American poetry. So that was brilliant. And then I've done work in the with the Poetry Translation Center, again working with people from different backgrounds, going to workshops not only for Latin American poetry, but from different parts of the world. And that experience was really fascinating, because we were working with, for instance, I was translating poets from Peru and Chile, and also Argentina, and people who didn't speak Spanish, and we were translating all together these poems, and that was absolutely fantastic. It was like sort of exploring language in a completely different way. Yeah, I don't know if I answer that. Correctly.
No, that's like, I think that's a great answer. I mean, the UK, this I think is interesting, maybe of interest to our US audience, which is that in the UK, I mean, there's a political reason why students in this London school might have been surprised by their ability to use Spanish in an academic, creative context. I mean, Spanish is an emerging language in the UK. There's a very large immigrant population, especially in London. But the idea of a Latinx identity, it's erased a lot in society, right? It's not on the census. It's very different from the US, where you live in Southern California, where I grew up, and you can conduct your entire life in Spanish or in many other languages. And the same is true in many parts of the US. So that way in which your work with them draws out the possibility of or calls attention to this community is really important. And this leads me to kind of the final point that I'd like to talk about with you this evening, which is whither British Latinx poetry. I mean, a few seasons ago, you and Natalie Teitler co-edited an issue of the wonderful UK journal Magma. And in this piece, or in this collection, or introducing these pieces, you and Nat had a small essay written mostly by her, but there was a part of it that was yours. That was kind of manifesto on British Latinx poetry. And I want to quote from this manifesto in brief excerpts, just so that everyone's on the same page. You say, this is you, Leo. Our poetry will be radical, with traditional English syntax and rhythm. 2, our poetry will embrace bilingualism. It will include Spanish and English, idiomatic phrases, new Spanglish words, things like that. 3, our poetry will allow for a multiplicity of ethnic and identity backgrounds that includes not just Spanish and Portuguese languages of empire, but also indigenous languages, different cultural experiences or expressions of Latinx history and culture. And 4, our poetry will not seek your permission. Right? Could you talk about how you came to this manifesto, and where, now that it's been a few years since the issue came out, what are your thoughts on the reception of this, or how I can move forward?
Yeah, I wrote the manifesto specifically for a report. This report I've got here called Free Verse, Diversity in British Poetry. 2005, 2017, sponsored or financed by the Arts Council England, and they commissioned me to write a piece for the report, and I wrote the manifesto. It was the first time that the Latinx was included in this. The Latinx experience was included in this report. The report was looking at how diverse was the British poetry landscape. The Freedbirds was a very important report because this was the second report, and the previous one found out that only 1% of poets of color or from diverse backgrounds were being published in the main publishers in the UK, and because of that report, the complete work scheme began. They realized that the people, they had to be, they had to do a lot of work. So by the time that the second report was published, I was involved. I was involved in the report. I was involved in the complete works, and the manifesto was just a manifesto of my own and perhaps my friends from the community with whom we discussed some of these issues. And in fact, they invited me to an event, and I read this manifesto because it came out of my preoccupations and my interests. This idea of being radical and being able to experiment with syntax, for instance, or the idea of bilingualism, as you mentioned. Being able to explore things of exile or migration. So it was quite important for me because it's now part of the report with the Arts Council, and they use this manifesto to just to basically to get this voice out there. And now that I read it, it feels I would add more things. And in fact, for the Magma edition that we edited, that edition was the issue was the first issue in the UK solely dedicated to Latin America and Latinx poetry. It was the first time that a UK publication was, dedicating a whole issue of, to the Latinx. And so we wanted to include some of those points from the manifesto, and it's growing because the landscape is growing. There's just definitely more Latinx poets, because I remember when I was teaching at that school, there were teenagers, and some of those teenagers are now writing poetry seriously and in workshops, and now the list is growing and growing. And for instance, in festivals, in literary festivals, the Latinx, we ask them, do you have a Latinx poet? Do you have someone representing the community? And they take it seriously. But this is something really, really new. Remember, this report was published in 2018, and before that, it was completely invisible. As the scheme that we started, Invisible Presence, we literally were invisible. We weren't in any forms. I remember Natalie writes about it, that we went to London Book Fair, and in one event we were together, and I asked a question, and I mentioned if they had Latinx voices in that anthology, and they said no. And they just say in Latinx, what is Latinx? And we don't have Latinx writers in the UK, and the Latinos or Latin Americans writing in Spanish, they never write in English. I was so shocked, and we were so shocked with Natalie that pretty much Un Nuevo Sol started from that, and so many schemes that we started and we are involved with currently.
Absolutely. No, I mean, and Natalie here in that essay in Magma writes and shows some kinds of trends in British Latinx. And she talks about how if you have three siblings and one of them is Latin American poetry, one is American Latinx poetry, and one is British Latinx poetry. British Latinx poetry is like the kid sibling, the youngest in the bunch, who that this poetry is still emerging, that even
Mhm.
awareness of this literary community is nascent. And
it was, I think it was so important for us to look at the US Latinx experience, because we looked at that experience and we learned a lot from the experience, and that's why I was reading a lot of Latinx writers. You know, Francisco, I remember reading his poetry and taking his poetry to schools in London, and in a way that's why I remember when we began calling ourselves Latinx writers, British Latinx writers, people were like, but why Latinx? You use Latinx in the US, why? And so we were trying to explain the experience of Latinx poets and writers and people in the US. And because otherwise, what we had in the past was, people saying, okay, you are Latin American, therefore you're not, you're not involved here in what's happening, or if you have perhaps a parent that is from Latin America, what are you? There were no, there wasn't no classification at all. So the Latinx
concept of diaspora is like a mystery or something.
Exactly. It was a way of encompassing all those communities. First generation, second generation, third generation, yeah, it was a much more inclusive. And now, we have in the census. No, in the census, in one of the forms that you
the
get.
Arts Council application.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now you have it, and
I checked it off. I was so proud. Yeah. But also this idea that even though British Latinx poetry is the baby sibling, the kid brother, learning or receiving it, taking American Latinx poetry as an influence, or taking influence from Latin American poets, there is also a very palpable way in which British Latinx poetry is in a position to influence other literary traditions. That's something that Nat writes about in this mm-hmm. piece that I find really compelling, that it is making it's an impact in British literary culture and literary traditions, influencing poets from other diasporas, and that's really inspiring. So that it kind of reflects the community that we brought together for this panel. People in Latin America, people in North America, people in the UK, exchanging, cross-pollinating ideas, and that's how this grows. The tensions of linguistic in-betweenness becomes a possibility for collaboration, and also the possibility of being inscribed into this new literary tradition. And I find that really exciting. I think we should begin to wrap this up a little bit. So I wondered if you might now read us a poem.
Yes. So I'm going to read the title poem of the book, Ballad of a Happy Immigrant.
Page for the people who might want to follow along, like in school.
It's page 19.
Thanks.
Ballad of a Happy Immigrant. In the beginning, there was a garden and a boy who counted ants, dug for bulbs. All this he enjoyed. Come back a man or never come. Father greased the Peugeot, his blasting radio of 80s techno on. Learn. One day you will need to know. Come back a man or never come. The spaniel dog under the kitchen table, the endless heat, the dusty sparrows on hanging cables. Come back a man or never come. Mother's palm leaf dresses, her sandals. The day she left, they took her things. I lit a candle. Come back a man or never come. Father dressed younger and then remarried. After a loved, sweet wife, he quickly buried. Come back a man or never come. We moved 2 times, from south to north. Some things we took, some we forgot. Come back a man or never come. My sisters shared a fuchsia room, their ploys. I found a corner where I hid my joys. Come back a man or never come. I went on trains to school and back. At home the fights, burned steaks, news cracks. Come back a man or never come. The night I left, I gave some clues. Look out for me, my ties, my shoes. Come back a man or never come. A shared old flat in Naysborough Court, 6 a room, a kitchenette, my home of sorts. Come back a man or never come. My lousy English searched out for words, though found I still could communicate with birds. Come back man or never come. I met very few men, went out to clubs. Some were smarter than others, and one night at the NFT, I met the artist. Come back a man or never come. The daily trips to Hampstead Heath, late coffees in Soho, we kissed in Russell Square. A builder shouted, "You too, homos." Come back a man or never come. We moved together by the flower market, our tiny flat on Columbia Road. A new life had started. Come back a man or never come. Long distance phone calls, Dad and his orchids, his health, his lungs, the chats more morbid. Come back a man or never come. I nursed him a week, his bloody coughs, and he died as my London flight took off. Come back a man or never come. By the sea we found some peas. You drew till late, I planted dwarf trees. Come back a man or never come. Now I swim and swim, come sun or hail, the sea my friend, my foe, this holy grail. Come back a man or never come. And if they ask, is this your home? I say, well, yes, at least I hope.
Thank you, Leo. That poem is so moving and so powerful, and I love the percussive, haunting quality of that refrain. I want to close by saying, first, thank you to all the organizers once again, and to everyone present. Leo, thank you for sharing your heart with us, for sharing your words with us. I think any discussion of poetry is infused with love. That's something I learned from my friend Ricardo Maldonado, who's here this evening as well. And I hope you have felt in tonight's reading how much love we have for you and your work. So looking forward to new things to come.
Yeah, thank you so much, Yvette, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. I'm moved, and it's been wonderful, and yeah, thank you so much.